Hi, everyone. Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. Oh my, we have been talking everything DEI, Jedi. What does it mean and why is it important in our mission-based organizations? Well, for some nonprofits, they have begun the journey of DE&I, and for others, they are living it. There are also some who are still trying to work out the details. What does it mean to center equity in our work and include our staff in that process? Well, today we have a treat. We are talking to Elizabeth Bashir, who's been working with nonprofits and helping them live their DE&I commitment. So stay tuned, grab yourself a cup of coffee, and let's see what it really means to live DE&I.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Coffee Time with Masterminds. My name is Peta Blakely, and I'm the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I am Cynthia Rojas, founder and principal of To Your Growth.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I'm Rebecca Tuttle, founder and principal of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good.
Hi again. Oh, we're so happy you are on and you are watching Coffee Time with Masterminds. First, we want to say hello to our viewers all around the world and also our listeners in Australia. If you are watching us and you can, please put your name in the comment and tell us where you're from because we always want to hear that. And so Coffee Time is a 30-minute show where we talk about we talk about mission-based organizations with and for leaders. And as we know, these are complex times, and our hope is that we share information so that we learn and grow together. But today, I am joined by my co-host, Peta Blakely. Peta, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. I'm so good. We're continuing the conversation. Isn't this awesome?
It is. It is.
Yeah.
Some actionable steps.
Yes. And today we are speaking with Elizabeth Bashir, who has dedicated a big portion of her life in helping organizations think about and live their DE&I commitment. And so she's on the show. She's coming on the show to join us and have this conversation. Elizabeth, how are you?
Hello. Hi, Cynthia. Hi, Peta. It's wonderful to see you both. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, we also know that you've recently done a transition, and so we will have time to talk about that. But I met you as someone who was working with nonprofits and DE&I and really making that how they look and think about their work. And so we wanted to bring you on and just hear, like, so many organizations are struggling. Where do I begin? How do I do it? What does it look like? Right? But you've helped them live it. Right? So let's start with Peta and let's put this into context. When we say DE&I, when we say Jedi, what are we talking about, Peta?
That's a great question. And Elizabeth can probably fill this out a lot better than I can. Right? So here's how I think of it is like we started with diversity. And then we realized, oh, this doesn't really work, right? Like we have these people in the room, but they're not really at the table, right? They're not really being invited to participate. And we're still stuffing everybody into a model that was designed for a particular type of person, and it's not working for all of these people that we've invited here. And that's counterproductive, right? So we started to add some more concepts like equity, right? And like justice, right? And I think we're this only indicates that we're starting to understand this is complicated, right? Like the more we attempt to do it, the more complicated we realize it is, right? So Elizabeth, do you want to add on to that?
No, well, I think that you've done a great job so far. And I think you're absolutely correct. When you're looking at data and you're looking at diversity, it's very different than what encompassing all of these new acronyms, including justice, like you mentioned, belonging, authentic relationships, and of course, inclusivity. And so as you progress throughout this time, you see that it is really this onion. We're peeling back layers and we're making commitments every step of the way to really be inclusive of our own initiatives as well. So,
yeah. And so tell us a little bit about your work with organizations and what you were seeing when you were deep into this work before we move into what it's like to live it. So tell us from your perspective, what are organizations struggling with?
Right. I think from the very beginning, right, when you're really building that relationship with the new organization, with new leaders who are coming to you in hopes to really transforming either their organization, maybe they're looking for reconciliation or healing, and you begin to have these conversations and you learn at the surface level what's happening in my organization, right? And once you have an idea of what that looks like, your vision starts to shift and change. So some of the challenges is coming to a consultant or someone external from your organization and requesting that support, and maybe being lost a little bit of what direction do we need to go in? What is it that we actually need, right? And so when organizations are willing and committed to really taking a look, being provided a mirror of their organization, internal and externally, to be able to really begin to formulate what it is that an organization needs. And so it is difficult to come to a place where you understand what it is that you need and your starting place. That's most difficult. And so looking to someone for that support is somewhat key in most cases.
Yeah, I have to admit, you make it sound beautiful, and it's messy. It's messy, right? Because there are feelings, and
Right.
we could talk about, I mean, Peter and I have a slight difference of opinion in terms of, you know, I think it's with Peter. I talk to a lot of people, but I think Peter, a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about, you know, what's the role of organizations in helping their staff heal? And I'm not sure that healing is it belongs in the workplace. And I think, Peter, you said, well, what if the workplace caused harm? Right. So
I think this is such a complicated issue. I don't have an opinion, so I don't think we had a difference of opinion. I think we just had a lot of questions, right?
Yes.
I hear that, oh, let's heal can sound to me like, let's just smooth this over and be nice and friendly. Like, let's not have a really unsightly, awkward, uncomfortable conversation, right? It can come off that way to me sometimes. And so I think that's part of my response to it. And then another part is you really can't invite people to have a very intimate, personal conversation when you have not done anything to make them feel safe in this environment. Like, it's not a fair assumption to think that your minoritized workers are going to show up to this conversation like super excited to help everybody heal, right? So that's my cynicism on that.
Yeah. I know that at some point in this conversation, we're probably going to jump into like, where should the work be centered? And I think it's also kind of like, what order do certain things need to come in? And that may look different per every organization. But to your point, Peter, it is important that we're not coming in and saying, well, there's been some harm, let's have healing conversations. Whereas a lot of the folks and leaders in that conversation may not be equipped to receive and to support and to guide through this conversation. Whereas you're then putting the onus and the responsibility on those marginalized staff members or workers to come into that conversation in their workplace and be vulnerable, which may not be possible given the lack of work or initiatives that have been put in place before that, if they happen at all.
Yeah. And so what does it mean to live out a DE&I commitment or a JEDI commitment? What does it look like? Well, what does it mean? And what does it look like within an organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is a great question. And I think that it's a pressing question because a lot of organizations are saying, what does it look like? And how can I mimic or do that same thing or bring that to my organization? And I think it looks different per organization. But in short, if an organization is truly living out their commitment to DEI, what it means is that they're actively participating and supporting and investing in spaces and programs and opportunities that are actively increasing the diversity of that organization, promoting inclusion and belonging, and really initiating projects around justice and all of the acronyms that are important to that specific organization, right?
Right.
And I know we hear so many acronyms, DEI, JB, JETI, right? And so there's a lot of acronyms. And so when you come to that place as an organization where you know the values that are encompassed in this acronym, and you want to make sure that you are really putting your best foot forward to achieve those values on a day-to-day basis within your organization.
I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is how most of the things about your work, right? Like where you work, how you get there, the structure of the building, the big business systems, the assumptions about how you should be dressed when you're there, right? All of these things come from a history of white supremacy and misogyny, right? How do you really do JEDI, right? Without doing all of the work, right? I mean, how do you continue to do things? Do you have to rebuild the entire structure?
That's a wonderful question. I think that working with a number of organizations, there are some that are doing their best to raise awareness in efforts to maybe pivot or shift a bit in order to put themselves in a place where they are achieving equity, where they are achieving inclusion. But there are certain cases where it is difficult. And I think that there are certain leaders that have such a level of awareness and such a commitment that it does look like rebuilding. It does look like a leader stepping down and putting someone else in their place. It does look like board members having term limits. It does look like actively hiring for positions with real intention, and taking holistic approaches to interviews, thinking about what policies and benefits are in place when we onboard new staff or new leaders. So, and the list goes on, right? And so I think that it's very, very important for an organization to get real with themselves, who they are as leaders, as a culture, as a board, and really learn where they are starting, because then there's a fair assessment to determine, do we need to burn it down and start over? Or are there certain things that we have yet to implement that could drastically transform and change the way things have been done up to this point? And I think that it takes, again, that really keen eye for each organization to really take a look and ask for help. Lean into your consultant friends, lean into these organizations that exist to support you in that work. So that way you have the clarity and the guidance that you need to start making these changes and these transformations.
I love that. I love that. You know, Peter, when you asked the question, the first thing I thought about were bathrooms. Right.
Right. Here's a simple structural problem.
Yeah. And how your traditional bathrooms just don't work anymore. And so if you have people in wheelchairs, or you have people who do not identify with a specific gender, then it sounded like you would tear down the building and start again. I'm thinking we'll move. Everyone gets their own bathroom.
Right. When I tear down, I mean, I think the introvert in me is like, well, everybody just needs to work from home. Right? That solves our bathroom problem. It solves our lactation problems. It solves our prayer space problems.
Right. Yeah. Well, and Zoom, one of the great things about Zoom is that, and people have talked about this, Elizabeth. I wonder if you have had conversations. It makes everybody equal, right? We all have the same size box. And so it's been interesting. And you see people, unless of course you have like 50 people and then you have 2 screens. Yeah. But in the meeting, everyone's the same size. And there's some control about, talking and speaking and all that good stuff. There's no head of the table. And so that's been lifted as an interesting cultural shift in how
that's very interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting that you say that, because I think that there could be different experiences where it could be extremely limiting, whereas For example, we know historically, Black women of color are historically marginalized to the point where we're not listening, right? There's no space in these boardrooms, in these leadership in these rooms, in these spaces, whether virtual or in person. And so though we are the same size, though we can mute and show ourselves when we choose to, and there seems to be a lot of freedom there, it may increase the opportunity for certain folks to be unheard in a virtual space. So I hear you when it's saying, well, this is a level playing field in a lot of ways, because there's not one person standing and speaking and towering over the table, but you very well could take up lots of space. Someone may not want to interrupt you as quickly or say, oh, let me jump in quickly because I can't necessarily see you, right? And so
Right.
myself and others may very well take up more space than they may have been granted. And that could as well happen just as easily. And so I'd be curious to know maybe individual experiences. Is there intentionality behind the virtual spaces that have been created at certain organizations to ensure that the experience that you mentioned is the one that's coming through?
Yeah.
And
No.
I'm
Go ahead.
seeing organizations develop their own Zoom space cultures. And so it'll be, interesting to see like how that, right? Like some organizations have a lot going on in the chat, and there's kind of inequality of that everybody is talking and participating simultaneously. But it would be very interesting.
Yeah.
We'll do this for our next dissertations.
There you go.
Like how use of the Zoom space reflects or does not reflect, right, organizational norms in the physical space.
Yeah. One of the things, Peter and I would love to talk to an organization where it's not going well, right? But this is again a sensitive issue, and that may be hard to talk about in public. But I wonder if you could share some experiences you've had with organizations where it didn't go well, and that you could see why, but they were probably stuck in the wrong space.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple things that stick out immediately across the board, whether they're small, mid-sized to large and very successful nonprofit, foundations. There's two really essential issues, and it's the lack of trust from staff is one of the biggest things, because though organizations have been transforming and making different decisions and evolving to be more equitable and more inclusive and more diverse, what's happening is if there is a lack of trust, there's less engagement throughout the staff. Staff may even feel that they don't want to show up to opportunities to speak about these things in the workplace, because if there has been harm, as Peter mentioned, I am less likely to show up in that space to offer a hand, to volunteer my time when I already work full time, right? And continue to push forward in these efforts. And so I'm exhausted, I'm depleted as a staff person, right? And we see that happen across the board, and I think that when we are working towards a lot of these initiatives, sometimes we are not putting them into practice before we are having these conversations with our staff. So they are less likely to engage, right? And so if I'm lacking trust that this is a real commitment and it's not performative, I'm going to maybe take a step back. And so now your engagement and your value add from your staff is slowly decreasing, essentially. And so when that happens, it's extremely difficult for that organization to stay on track and to continue to sustain initiatives moving forward. And so you may have to take a step backwards. And a lot of organizations don't want to do that. A lot of leaders say, well, we've come this far, I don't want to go back and rewrite. But a lot of times what we see is that we are going to have to either derail or take a detour to get to our
that
goal.
whole idea that projects are linear and move forward is cultural, right?
Correct.
It's part of the problem.
That entire framework comes from the same place. The inequality comes from, we could have viewed it as a circular process from the start.
Yeah. When you're thinking, oh no, I'm sorry, Cynthia, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'm just thinking, to continue off of what Pete is mentioning here, is we're talking about this white supremacy culture and how it yields true in a lot of our partnerships with organizations, how they make decisions, hierarchical aspects kind of come up in the work as well. And so when you're thinking about partnership, right, with our organizations that we've been working with, it's really difficult to kind of unchain them from where they are in their belief systems to really see where they are. And it's difficult because they might want to control the process. They might want to really have a hand. They want to say yes or no, when in reality, we're still really learning and we're still really figuring things out, and we have to be flexible. So to your point, when organizations are lacking that flexibility, it becomes a barrier and a challenge to them moving forward and truly transforming internally.
Yeah, and let's be honest, we've been operating this way all of our lives, or most of our lives, and so undoing that takes time.
It does.
Yeah.
It does.
And
yeah.
so another thing Peter and I have talked about that we would love your insight is, do you do the internal work first? Do you do the internal and the external at the same time? Do you start with the external? Like, what? And so I know you talked about order, but it's a lot. And by external, I mean, do you look at the systems in how you work with the people you serve, and also look at your internal systems, and work with your board, and work with your funders? Oh my God, this is like
I know. It can absolutely seem overwhelming. And I think that because there's a lot of layers internally, a lot of organizations may want to jump to the part where they involve their stakeholders and they have community conversations, or they offer panels and networking events that are geared towards DEI and DEI education and raising that awareness. But when we think about kind of when our parents or our person in our life when we were young would say, listen, we're having company and we need to get the house in order, right? We need to make sure that the house is clean before we invite our guests in. And so, and that's a long process, right? That might feel overwhelming, but it is important to take those steps first. It's very similar. We're in parallel from the conversation we're having earlier with PETA about some of those like healing conversations. When should they be happening, if at all? So when it comes to engaging your stakeholders or your customers or your clients, you really want to ensure that we're not just using buzzwords or being performative on our initiatives and our services. Are we truly living that internally, right? Are we making room for everybody at the table? Are we truly listening when someone that we've invited is speaking, is adding value, has an idea, right? Those things have to happen first so that any initiatives or programs that we're running externally for our stakeholders is not performative, because that is where harm sets in, specifically for people of color. We see you. Right? We see you. And so if we know, especially as a staff member, that I'm not getting the support or the attention or the time to really sit within my staff or within my team and feel safe and included, like I belong there, I'm less inclined to provide that product or service or initiative for that stakeholder. And so in my opinion, right, I would say that really get your house in order, really think about your board, think about your leadership team, think about your staff engagement, your policies, all these things, right, before we think about the impact that we're yet to make in our community.
I love that. I love that. Okay. Wow. How do you have some tips for the leader where this is new to them and they're trying to figure out, are they living it? Are they still in the early part of it? Like, how do we know? And I am assuming that this journey never ends.
Right.
And so living it is forever. So how do I know if I'm living it as a leader in an organization?
How do I know if I'm living it? Are you living in a spirit of positive inquiry? Are you living in a spirit of curiosity? Are you truly committed to learning things that you may have never heard before? And these are the questions that you want to really ask yourself, right? And so when you are living in that spirit of curiosity and you have questions for someone and you are willing to learn, that is the best place that you can put yourself when you are first starting on this journey, is allowing yourself to model what it looks like to your staff, to your leadership team, what it looks like to be curious, and what it looks like to actively listen, and what it looks like to really take other experiences seriously, look at data, really jump in. Am I committed? Am I curious? Because when you have the curiosity, you have less limiting beliefs that are taking over what you're learning, what you're hearing. And so we are more inclined to ask a question rather than defend, or rather than respond. And I think, again, when you're living in that spirit, you are a leader that is going to be able to have a sustainable initiative within your organization. You're modeling the way and you're living in that spirit. And I also think that as you move through this and you lean into your board and you lean into your staff and your leadership, you're going to want to ask other questions, right? So what are those specific questions? So to leave you with just a couple here, it's, how would you describe your internal culture right now as is? How would you describe it? What does it make you feel, right? What questions do you have when you're thinking about it on your own? How would you describe your company's core values? Because the one thing that an organization always has is their values. But what does that say? And how are we living in those values as it pertains to DEI? So now that we're marrying our efforts with our internal operations and capacity, it becomes one. Now our core values also need to speak to those specific initiatives as you move forward, right? And what are your goals? What are your targets, right? For diversity, for inclusion, what have you set those yet, right? If
Yeah,
you've done those things, you're at least moving in the right direction.
I love that. I love
But I
that.
think when you talk about setting your goals, like this is a moving target, right? I mean,
Yes.
right, we are just continually realizing, we started with some gender diversity, and then we thought, like, let's open this to different race ethnic groups, and then we thought, right, a little bit broader and a little bit broader, and now, right, I think at every step we realize, oh, there is still somebody who's been forgotten, right?
Yeah.
There's still some group that's not being accommodated here. I
Right.
don't think that we're ever going to finish.
I don't think so. I think even as being in the space of a practitioner, I think that there is still room for this learning opportunity to be a two-way street. Because like you said, there may be someone that we have not represented, that we have not spoken to directly, or we have not learned from. And they say, hold on, I'm here. And this is my experience. This is what I need, right? And so the practitioner as well say, thank you. Right? We're learning with you. And so that's the evolution. And I think what it requires to that point is a massive amount of grace for yourself, for your colleagues. And I think that as you learn and knowing that, it allows you to be flexible with what you're learning. It allows you to unchain yourself from this old mentality.
Yeah,
And it
so much
allows us to be
humility.
inclusive.
Say that
again.
like, oh, we can assimilate new information and not beat ourselves up about not knowing that before.
Right.
Yeah, I love
Right.
that.
We need to do
I
our
love
best.
that.
Right.
Well, I also wanted to give you some space. You have shifted your focus, no pun intended, and started a business called Focus Locus. And I want to hear what are you doing now?
Yes, thank you. So I moved from a full-time position with the firm that did DEI and racial equity work, which was absolutely amazing, having that experience under my belt in a more formal setting. And moving into January and launching Focus Locus, I still have the opportunity to work very closely with firms that are working directly in this space. So I'm very, very lucky and honored to be able to still practice in this space.
Nice.
But Focus Locus has kind of grown a new branch, essentially, off of me, where I am focusing on offering coaching and consulting to entrepreneurs and artists who are looking to move from side hustle to profitable art business. And so when we're talking about that consulting arm, we're talking about your brand identity, telling your story, connecting with your community, and really earning an awesome income through passion. So I have been very fortunate to work with a beautiful community of artists in Southeastern Connecticut. And that's where I am now, in the direction I'll be taking this year.
That's
fascinating. Very exciting.
Thank you. Thank you. A little bit of everything,
I learned something recently. We were talking to the director of research for a labor department in the Eastern United States. And he was talking about how many people moved into entrepreneurship during the pandemic, right? And a lot of people who either lost their jobs or just realized their jobs were not worth it, right? And the huge number of business licenses and LLCs that were created during that period.
Exactly.
And he said, a couple of years later, the vast majority of small businesses close in the first year, right? So a year or two later, he expected those people to come back into the workforce. And he said, they're not. They're still out there. These businesses are making it. Really interesting.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have seen so many resources become available more virtually and become more accessible when it comes to entrepreneurs really looking for this guide, right? If there was one, it would be amazing. But it really is amazing to find this small business community, to find folks really bring their visions to life, and they're sticking, like you mentioned. So it's really exciting stuff.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was going to say, you're going to be very busy, because if there's anything
Yep.
we've learned from the pandemic is that we all need to follow our passion.
Absolutely.
And so I love to talk to people who just get up in the morning to do what they're doing. Like they come alive in a
Right.
way that I didn't see back in the 90s or the early 2000s.
Right.
I see a big difference in people. So good for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because we're driven by passion, right? When you're
Yeah.
able to marry those two and realize, oh, I can support myself, I can pay my bills and live in this spirit, right? And so helping entrepreneurs and helping artists and helping people in general really learn how they can marry the two, passion and entrepreneurship, and be successful, and really just change the way they look at some of the boring things like QuickBooks. You know, so
You agree.
Yeah, it
We
is.
agree.
It's boring, but also freeing.
exactly.
All right. Well, this has been exciting. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. You
Thank
could
you.
see that Pete and I, we remain curious, and we
Yeah.
too have questions. And
And the more we talk about this, the more questions we have.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it seems like that's how you know you're living it, according to Elizabeth. Are you still
take that as a sign we're doing it right?
Right.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Peter and Cynthia.
Thank
Have a
you.
great
And
weekend,
bye to our viewers and listeners.